Now, for our next speaker, we have the pleasure of having Professor Alice Stanton. Alice is hugely respected in her own field. She's a professor in the Royal College of Surgeons of Ireland, and also Director of Human Health in Devonish, nutrition, based up in a hugely historic site in County Meath on the Boyne at Doubt. Professor Stanton will say that, or Alice, if I may, I'd particularly like to draw your attention to, the Lancet is the Bible. It's the absolute go-to for people in the whole medical profession. And the Lancet has been taking a pretty strong line against things like meat and so on. And Alice has been hugely courageous, but also, along with about 5 other distinguished medical professionals, professors across Europe, in terms of asking the Lancet, asking repeatedly, where is the evidence for some of the claims that you're actually making? And we'll say that the claims have strongly exceeded the research evidence. So we'll say that it's like a fish being sort of hooked. We'll say the Lancet is gradually being sort of brought to the bank. We'll say that, as dairy farmers, we'll say that we should always support the best science, we'll say that, and ensure that the good information gets well disseminated. But we owe Alice our thanks, we'll say, for actually acting extremely courageously and going up against a huge heavyweight like the Lancet. So, Professor, we'll say you're hugely welcome here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thanks for that introduction. I'm very pleased to be here, and I've been given the challenging title of Dairy as a Prime Food Source. Should you guys continue to produce milk for human nutrition? So will I put you out of your misery? The answer is yes. But there are challenges that you should be aware of, and that's what I'm going to discuss through my presentation, along with our challenge to the Global Burden of Disease collaborators who published in the Lancet. I'm involved in a lot concerning nutrition and sustainability. I am an employee and owner of stock with Devonish Nutrition. Owen Brennan is my husband. I sometimes say I sleep with the chairman as my disclosure. And I'm an omnivore. We're going to start with the WHO definition of a healthy diet. And a healthy diet needs to do 2 things. It needs to protect against malnutrition in all its forms, and it needs to protect against the non-communicable chronic diseases which a large number of us suffer ill health from in our middle and older years and die from. So the heart attacks, the strokes, the cancers, diabetes mellitus. We're not doing very well. Of the 8 billion of us in the world, it's an absolute shame that almost 1 billion are undernourished. They don't get enough calories to sustain them. These children go to bed hungry. It's also a shame that almost 2 billion of us now, almost a quarter of the world, is either overweight or actually obese, where their weight is doing harm to their health. What's less well recognized is that at least 2 billion, and it's more actually, suffer from hidden hunger. And that's where they have enough calories, but their diet is inadequate qualitatively. In particular, insufficient quality protein, the essential amino acids, and insufficient key minerals and vitamins. So iron, selenium, iodine, zinc, vitamin D, vitamin B, vitamin A, B12. And in fact, all of those key ingredients are either solely got or are best got from animal source foods. The left-hand panel shows the top commonly deficient micronutrients, the vitamins and minerals that people are commonly deficient in. And of the top 20 listed foods there, which you probably can just about read, 18 of the 20 are animal source foods. 4 of those are actually dairy products, so milk, cheese, and yogurt. Goat milk in addition to cow's milk. Looking at it in another way, this is a study that was conducted across, I think, 200 countries. And they looked at the percentage of calories that came from animal source foods on the horizontal axis. And they looked at what was the likelihood of there being deficiencies in, what was the likelihood of there being deficiencies in vitamins and in minerals. And basically, if less than 30% of calories in the human diet comes from animal source foods, there is increasing prevalence of both vitamin and mineral deficiencies. Now, these are levels, but actually let's look at an actual hard endpoint. And the worst adverse outcome from malnutrition is childhood stunting. And that's not just small kids, it's kids that are damaged both physically and mentally. Their brain in particular is less well developed. So therefore they engage less and achieve less in schooling, lesser career options, and then lesser ability to provide for their families. So you get a vicious circle between various generations. These are the areas in pink where childhood stunting is greater than 30%. So 1 in 3 kids are stunted in sub-Saharan Africa and in Southern Asia. They're the exact same areas where where meat intake, dairy intake, and seafood intake is least. So they're observational studies, but let's look at an actual interventional study, which is the gold standard of evidence. And this is a study that was conducted in Kenya amongst primary school kids. And what they did was, over 5 semesters, which is 2 years, they actually randomized 12 schools in groups of 3 schools to 4 different eating patterns. One group got a plain vegetable stew supplied to the children every day they turned up in school. The next group got the vegetable stew with milk added. Next group got the vegetable stew with meat added, red meat in fact. And then there was the control group that unfortunately got no additional feeding. So regard the vegetable stew and the control group as the actual controls. They looked at the children's performance over the 5 semesters in 7 different subjects. So arithmetic, English, 2 national languages, geography, science, and the arts. And the headline is, when they summed up all of their scores at the end of 2 years of tuition, the children who were in the meat and vegetable stew group scored 17% higher on average. That's a huge difference. Those that got the milk and the vegetable stew plus 13% by comparison with the two control groups. That's a huge difference. And here we have two studies published in 2022 which show actually that it's not a good idea to eat too little animal source foods if you want to live long. However, we must bear in mind that our food system is contributing to climate change. And I'm a physician, so I do not want climate change because it'll have disastrous effects on human health. So the heat and extreme weather events will kill people, as will droughts and desertification, particularly endangering food security. We'll have more vector-borne diseases such as mosquitoes migrating, yes, even to Ireland, and causing malaria. And we'll have increasing violence and unrest, resulting in increased poverty, inequalities, and migration. So we in the global north will actually be visited with an increasing level of attempted or succeeded migration from the global south. So, in fact, I welcomed one of the Lancet publications from the Eat Lancet Commission reference diet as the first attempt to balance climate change and the food system. And I agree with we should be eating more fruit, vegetables, legumes, nuts and seeds. But I have concerns about the recommendation that we should halve meat and dairy intakes. I also have concerns about whether we can achieve the doubling of fruit and vegetables that they are recommending. So, hands up who's eating 5 portions of fruit and vegetables every day. Hands up those who are going to increase that to 10 portions of fruit and vegetables a day. Don't see a single hand. But that's what it would take to actually achieve the reference diet. And are we going to achieve that worldwide? Highly unlikely. I've been trying to persuade people for years to eat more fruit and vegetables. Furthermore, the Lancet, Eat Lancet reference diet authors said that would save, if everyone switched over to their diet, that would save 11 million deaths per year worldwide. But that was going to come from the reduced intake of calories, the reduced intake of salt, and the increased intake of fruit and vegetables. It wasn't going to come from the halving of meat and dairy intakes. Their diet took no account of the nutritional deficiencies that I've just discussed with the previous slides, if you halved meat and dairy intake. And in fact, as I'll show you, halving of dairy would actually increase obesity, high blood pressure, diabetes, cancer, and cardiovascular deaths. Despite those reservations being publicly expressed in both the medical and in the general media, there's been a deluge of further publications that recommend dramatic reductions or exclusion of animal source foods, so meat, dairy, fish, and eggs from the human diet. And it's not just in the scientific literature. So in the Times, this was published, coming from one of the medical publications. Cutting out red meat and processed meat will be one of the most important shifts, and that would add an average of 1.6 years to a young woman's lifespan and 1.9 years to a man's. But we're not going to look at that study. We're actually going to look at the global burden of disease studies. And the reason we're going to do that is because all of the other publications are either using the data from the global burden of disease study, or they're actually using a similar method of analysis. The other reason we're going to look at the global burden of disease studies is because they are the most influential in the world. So it's their data and their analysis that are quoted by the FAO of the United Nations, by the World Health Organization, the European Commission. Yes, Farm to Fork strategy used Global Burden of Disease 2017 analysis to justify their comments on reduced red meat and dairy. They misquoted actually Global Burden of Disease 2017. They exaggerated what Global Burden of Disease 2017 had said. But let me tell you, if they use Global Burden of Disease 2019, they won't have to exaggerate it. The National Food Strategy, which was for England, used Global Burden of Disease 2019 data. And in fact, the Eat Lancet Commission actually used Global Burden of Disease data for their analysis. Now, the Global Burden of Disease collaborators are not shy. They're led by the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation, University of Washington, Seattle. And they recently self-described themselves as being the de facto source for global health accounting. Now, if you are that influential, you need to be both transparent and evidence-based. And are they? This is a detailed study, or slide. What it shows is both the Global Burden of Disease 2017 in navy columns and the Global Burden of Disease 2019 analyses in red. And it looks at dietary risk factors causing deaths. And you can see that the excessives that cause deaths, the top ones are diets that are high in calories or diets high in sodium or salt. And the top deficiencies are child and maternal malnutrition, and childhood stunting is one of the worst outcomes from child and maternal malnutrition. And then diets low in whole grains, low in fruits, seeds, etc. They do actually admit that diets low in milk are causing deaths. It's an underestimate, as I will show you later on. But what we're going to focus on is the change between 2017 and 2019 for unprocessed red meat. The 2017 analysis said that 25,000 deaths worldwide were being caused by excessive red meat consumption. That's tiny, given that diets high in calories were actually causing almost 5 million deaths. However, the 2019 analysis says that unprocessed red meat from the first mouthful was causing almost 900,000 deaths. So that's a 36-fold change in the number of deaths attributed to unprocessed red meat. They said that unprocessed red meat was causing colon cancer, breast cancer, heart attacks, strokes, and diabetes mellitus without providing any evidence whatsoever. So they said that the relationship between red meat consumption in grams per day was like this. From the first mouthful, there was a statistically significant increase in deaths, which continued to increase throughout the whole range of red meat eating habits in the world. So this is the actual amounts of red meat that are consumed worldwide, and it's a trimodal distribution. This is some of the high-income countries, and not so high. So this really would be the consumption pattern from South America and from Eastern Europe. In fact, in Western Europe, we're more around 25 grams a day, and then very low consumption in some of the very low-income countries. But the vast majority of the world is eating less than 75 grams per day, which equates to about 500 grams per week. So 3 to 4 portions of red meat a week. So that's what we should look at. Now, we compared this relative risk curve with what we actually saw in the medical literature. And these are the 12 large studies that actually counted up the number of deaths that occurred in relation to red meat consumption. None of these studies showed an increased risk below 25 grams a day. None of the global studies, European studies or Asian studies, showed an increased risk below 75 grams a day. 2 of the North American studies out of 3 did show a rise with 50 grams per day. Because of our concern about the disparity between what was the actual evidence and what Global Burden of Disease 2019 was saying was the evidence, we wrote a letter to The Lancet. We confronted many obstacles. It took us 9 months to get our letter published, but we did get it published after investigative journalists got interested and started asking questions of The Lancet of why were they blocking publication of our letter. We asked 2 key questions. Where's the evidence? And it must be published in a particular format which allows scientists to interrogate it and to actually see whether it's valid or not. And that's the PRISMA and the Gather statements. And we also asked them, what would happen to iron deficiency anemia, elderly fragility, and child and maternal malnutrition if we accepted that the optimal intake or the theoretical minimum risk exposure level was no red meat eating? So what would happen to these deficiency conditions? A month later, we did get an answer from the Global Burden Disease collaborators. They actually said, yeah, no, we actually made some errors. The red meat TMREL or optimal intake should not be 0. It's not correct. And in fact, we really only have weak evidence that there's a relationship between red meat and the various outcomes. And in fact, in actual fact, red meat protects against hemorrhagic stroke rather than actually cause it. So they've admitted the errors. They hadn't answered our questions. They actually hadn't provided the peer-reviewed published evidence that we could check. And they said, we are not going to consider the totality of nutritional effects of red meat. We were delighted when a couple of months later in 2022, we were joined by authors from the Academy of Nutrition Sciences and the World Cancer Research Fund in the call for the evidence. So they said, we support Stanton and colleagues' call. They used terms like implausible, lack of transparency. We never recommended complete avoidance of meat. Troublesome, unsupported by the evidence, unrealistic. We also got a decent amount of media and scientific interest in the broadsheets and in specialist agri-food journals and in social media. And I'm going to highlight one Twitter comment. This comes from Gordon Guyatt. He's a professor at McMaster University in Canada, and he's actually one of the founders of the concept of evidence-based medicine. So we no longer practice medicine based on opinion, we practice it based on evidence. And what he said was, calls for evidence remain unanswered even in the latest author's response. Big problem. In October, a couple of months later, in actual fact, in another journal, the Global Burden of Disease collaborators did publish a series of articles, one of which was focused on the evidence for red meat. So we now have the publications for the systematic reviews. And what they've admitted is actually there's either weak evidence or no evidence for a relationship between red meat and cancer, heart attacks and strokes. In fact, only one of those relationships was even of borderline statistical significance. They have agreed that actually there's no evidence for a zero intake of red meat. In fact, the optimal intake could be as high as 200 grams per day. This is an amazing climb down, and we welcome that. However, we remain very concerned that the original Global Burden of Disease 2019 publication has not been corrected and has not been retracted. It continues to be cited or referenced by almost 2,000 scientific articles and 20 policy documents. So it is continuing to do damage. One of those is another Lancet publication in October, just gone past. And this is, again, a regular publication occurring about every 2 years, looking at the relationship between human health and climate change, and where there has been progress taken on addressing these combined threats. In the area that looks at agri-food production and consumption, one of their headline findings is that in 2019 they said there was 11.5 million deaths were attributed to imbalanced diets, 17% or 2 million of them from red and processed meat and from dairy consumption. They used the Global Burden of Disease 2019 paper to justify their comments on red and processed meat. They used the Eat Lancet reference diet, and they said that only recommends one helping or 250 mLs of milk intake per day. And anyone who's consuming more than one helping or more than 250 mLs of milk or dairy products is consuming excessive calories. And that is causing obesity, and therefore that is causing 650,000 deaths per year globally. So that is what is being accused of dairy by the Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change without any evidence. And in fact, the evidence is the reverse. This is the consumption pattern of dairy worldwide. The vast majority of the world actually is consuming less than 300 mLs of dairy per day. This is the relationship between total dairy intake and overweight or obesity. So what it says is, actually, if you're consuming 2 or more helpings of dairy, you have a 50 to 60% protection against overweight and obesity. So dairy actually fights against obesity. It also fights against colon cancer. It also fights against heart attacks and strokes, so a 30% reduction in heart attacks and strokes or cardiovascular events, and a 25% reduction in total mortality, in actual deaths. So the more dairy, up to 3 portions a day, that you drink or eat, the less likely you are to die. All of the previous studies rely on self-report of dairy intake, but that's been backed up by an objective measure. So if you measure the amount of this fatty acid in blood, it's a marker of dairy fat intake. The higher the level of that marker in your blood, the less likely you are to suffer from a heart attack or stroke. We don't know actually which constituent of dairy is providing all these protections. It may be the protein, but it may well be the fat. And in fact, this relationship here pertains to fat, but actually the relationship with heart attacks, strokes, and mortality is much stronger for full-fat products, dairy products, than for skimmed milk. Which brings me to my almost last point. If we want to avoid climate change and environmental consequences, should we be moving over to plant-based meat and dairy alternatives? Is that the viable solution? And that's been raised by Michael Murphy. Well, the answer is no. All of these plant-based alternatives are ultra-processed foods. They are rich in salt, added sugars, and multiple cosmetic additives, so flavorings, colorants, stabilizers, etc. So the Beyond Meat burger has the same protein content as steak, but it has 5 times the salt and is causing heart attacks and strokes. The jackfruit and mushroom products are even worse. Much less protein, much more sugar and salt. And we do not want to be feeding unsweetened almond milk to our children. Twice the salt, 1/8 the protein, and 1/4 the zinc. We know that ultra-processed foods are strongly associated with obesity and with salt excess, and they are the biggest excesses that are causing illness and death worldwide. And we have that from both cross-sectional information showing the more ultra-processed food that you eat, the more likely you are to be obese. And we also have randomized controlled trials where if we take people into a clinic and feed them either ultra-processed food or unprocessed diet for 2 weeks, on average, those consuming the ultra-processed diet ate 500 calories per day more than those consuming the unprocessed diet. They gained over the 2 weeks 1 kilogram in weight, or they lost it with the unprocessed diet, so a difference of 2 kilograms over 2 weeks. Imagine if that was continued for months and lifelong. It wouldn't continue to rise, but you would arrive at probably a 10 kilogram difference in weight if you consumed a diet that was totally or almost totally consisting of ultra-processed food. And also, we're only measuring protein, fats, and carbohydrates, and a few key minerals and vitamins. And they're being made up into the ultra-processed foods, plant-based alternatives. It's not actually possible to mimic animal foods using those isolated chemicals. It underestimates the true nutritional complexity of whole foods in their natural state, so that we can't regard these alternatives as true replacements in terms of nutrition. And this comes from Stefan van Vliet in Duke University, and I totally agree with that. Cultured meats are ultra-processed foods. They're made from extracted plant protein with lots of other additives. Perfect day, animal-free dairy products are also ultra-processed food. They add in minerals, coconut-based fat, and table salt, or table sugar. So, my take-home messages are substantial reductions in the consumption of nutrient-rich animal source foods, particularly if we replace it with ultra-processed plant-based cultured or fermented alternatives, we will harm health. And it's women, children, the elderly, and those of low income that will be particularly adversely affected. We should continue to consume animal source foods in appropriate evidence-based quantities. It is of importance that all in the agri-food sector work to produce dairy, meat, eggs, and seafood ever more sustainably. But stakeholders, and that includes you, and policymakers should be extremely wary of global health estimates that are not rigorously and transparently evidence-based, and we must call for the evidence. Or estimates that ignore the protections against nutritional deficiencies afforded by animal source foods, and that ignore the protections against chronic diseases, heart attacks, strokes and cancers, and obesity by both dairy and long-chain omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids. Now, my last image. Are we doing enough to tell the good news story? I did a Google search on Guinness is good for you, and I immediately had hundreds of lovely images, such as is on the left-hand side. I did a Google search on milk is good for you, and it took me 15 minutes to find this nice image. So, are we doing enough? Thank you.
Thank you, Alice, we'll say, for a pretty remarkable talk. We'll say that I have two general questions for you. One of them you nearly answered. One will say that, I was horrified to hear that 60%, roughly 60% of the world's population is either 1.9 billion obese, we'll say, so obviously poor diets of some form or another, or that 33% of people are 11% grossly underfed, and another 22% will say that have diets that are lacking in significant nutritional composition. So the first question is, as society that's very wide-ranging, what can be done, we'll say, to better inform society of what really is a balanced diet? We'll say that's first question. The second question, which is the follow-up to really your last comments. As an industry, that we're well prepared to invest in land and, developing farms, developing processor, factories, etc. But would you have a notion of just what sort of resources we should be doing in promoting the nutritional value of things, that even if we have a good story, which we believe we have and which you're suggesting is true, roughly what kind of resources should we be prepared as farmers to dig into our pockets to support getting the real facts out to people?
Okay, on the first question, this is a whole society question, and it's inequalities in financial resources and inequalities in education that is certainly contributing to the unequal distribution of calories and of nutrient-rich foods. So that is a huge governmental challenge. Sorry, is that mic working?
It is.
Yep. Second question, I think there's two components. I think that what's happening within the scientific literature needs to be monitored and challenged. And that needs to be on an ongoing basis. And then what's happening in the general media needs to be coordinated. So I think both of those need to be resourced and on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, follow-up question to what you've just said will say that, there's an old saying that you're entitled to your opinions, but you're not entitled to your facts. And many journalists have actually become advocates for particular things, not being particularly well informed. Is there a need for the whole food industry to ensure that they have very articulate but extremely well-informed people, will say, that who will get onto all these shows and who will challenge, commonly held views. That the easiest way to spread a big lie is to just keep repeating it. Think of Donald Trump. And until and unless people are challenged by able people, will say, on every forum, if that doesn't happen, we'll say that that some of the things you've been describing will continue to be the situation.
Yeah, there is an issue that when the industry puts its side of the story, that they are accused of being vested interests. However, everyone is entitled to ask for the evidence and to ask for clarifications. So absolutely, farming groups and the agri-food industry and the unions are entitled to write to the Lancet and say, we're still waiting for the evidence. And to challenge that dairy is causing obesity.
And just one last question. Do you think, we'll say, the dairy industry and others, meat industry, have been asleep in terms of being very active in this area?
I don't think they've been asleep, and I think that the animal source food industry, including the dairy industry, has had multiple challenges. So animal welfare, the environment, but I think if you ignore the effect on human health, that would be very dangerous.
Okay, we'll throw it up into general questions, because Alice's talk was very wide-ranging and really well considered. Questions? Yeah, two up the middle and one over there then.
What do you think was the motivation by the Lancet to put out this misinformation that they couldn't back up?
The Lancet is well known for being controversial. It works like a newspaper, that actually the more controversial you are, the more times your articles are cited, and therefore the bigger the revenue. It is a private organisation. It has taken a stance on being that it is an environmental protector over the last 10 years, led by its editor-in-chief, Professor Richard Horton. And once it has decided that, and has decided that animal or livestock agriculture, and in particular ruminant agriculture, is damaging to the environment, it does appear as if the Lancet will publish all articles that are of that view.
Okay. Quick questions, yeah.
Yeah, good morning. Great talk. Thank you very much. Do you think, with the massive demand, increasing demand for food with a growing population, the red meat industry and dairy industry will be able to feed the amounts of food and grams per day that you're talking about? And also, on a second point, the Rethink's report and on precision fermentation are saying they're going to wipe out the red meat industry within 20 years. I'd just like your opinions on that, please.
So I didn't catch the second question. If you could just repeat that.
The Rethink's paper that was published about precision fermentation and wiping out animal agriculture or red meat agriculture. Your thoughts, please. Yeah,
I think Rethink covered both cultured meat and precision fermentation. There are huge problems with both cultured, well, definitely with cultured meat alternatives. Really big problems in upscaling and maintaining sterilization. it hasn't been solved as yet. There are huge costs, and even the one cultured meat, the chicken nuggets produced in Singapore, they actually were only about 70% cultured meat, and they needed pea extract, protein, and lots of other chemicals in order to stick the stuff together and give it some kind of a texture. All of those are huge problems, and even the energy costs of actually culturing meat have not been solved and don't look as if they will be solved. So it looks as if the cultured meat may well be a niche product, but no, it's not going to feed the world. I think going back to your first question of can we feed the world with meat and dairy, I think we need to get rid of the excesses. I'm not an advocate for a steak a day. It would mean that you are eating an unbalanced diet that will be unhealthy for you. Or you'd be eating too much, you'd be eating far too many calories, and you would be obese. And also, there's a question of equity. All of the world can't do that. Whereas if we get rid of the excesses of people who are eating too much of protein-rich foods, there will be more available for the rest of the world. Yeah. I think we absolutely have to do it sustainably, because otherwise all of food security will be endangered.
Okay. Would you put your hands up there? Okay, 1 3/4 way back. Any other hands? Yeah, okay.
Thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. My question is, you talk about evidence-based medicine. I was taught as evidence-based medicine, but I go and do lots of teaching of general population, young agri students, to those in school. And my constant question to them is, how do you find the evidence? Because I believe there's less than 2% of us here that actually feed the population. There's not many of us, vets, doctors, nurses, all taught evidence-based medicine, but your general population, look at social media, look at what is said. My question to you is, yes, we're talking about the evidence, we can get them to change it, but if the general population doesn't even know what that means, is not willing to ask the question, how can we change the public view?
I think that is a huge challenge. However, I think it's persuasive if you say having 2 helpings a day of natural dairy products makes you 50% less likely to be obese, 25% less likely to have a heart attack, stroke, colon cancer, or actually die. I think that's reasonably simple, and that those kind of messages need to be put out to the general public.
Yeah. I just ask a question there. We'll say, hands up anybody who's actually familiar with that message. Because, I mean, it's a pretty important statement that Alice has just said. We'll say that it just shows, if you like, we'll say that there, in terms of getting good information out to the public, we'll say that there's, we can do a lot better. Yeah, there was a question here.
Hi, yeah, thank you for your talk. Again, it's something similar to that. The plant-based community, there's a lot of public out there, of social media and in the news, but as a general farmer, how can we get our message out to our vegan friends as such?
I don't have all the answers. I think that it is actually something that the whole of the dairy and meat industry need to consider very carefully.
Important question, we'll say that.
And I think it is important to challenge it within the scientific literature and get that set straight. And then that empowers that any time any untruth is in the media, that it can be challenged. And yes, rather than always being on the back foot, go forward with the positive messages that are clearly there.
Yeah, I take two more questions, one out to the side there and one up the middle.
Oh, it's mine. Okay. Mr. Chairman, to answer your question, how much will it cost us? Millions. And I think as an industry, it's time we came up with the cash to defend the image of our industry. Social media is a new forum. I don't think we are scratching the surface of that medium at the moment. And we need, as an industry, not to talk to one another, but to talk to that media. And we need to finance that campaign. And it will cost millions. And we have to, put the money up.
I'll take that as a view and we'll go on to the next question.
Thanks, Alice. Great presentation. My name's Anya O'Connell. I work for the IFA in the dairy policy side. And yesterday we had an event on climate, and Ciarán Fitzgerald talked about the impact that lazy economics was having on policy. And today you're after showing how lazy science and prejudices being built into science is having an impact on policy. So moving further beyond kind of general populations, because policymakers are what shape our society. How do we integrate the research from credible researchers like yourself with the likes of the Commission, the Department, the policymakers to stop these prejudices creeping in and having massive impact far beyond the powers of social media?
Yeah, I think that's the other group that I didn't mention, the senior policymakers. And in fact, I've a Zoom meeting later on today with 2 European MEPs to discuss an event alongside the European Parliament to publicise this information that I shared with you today. And in fact, I'm going to Poland at the end of the month, and in the audience will be the EU Agriculture Commissioner, who has seemingly asked for the evidence to fight the inaccuracies in Farm to Fork. So that's part of a forum that I'm taking part in towards the end of the month. I think they're really important as well. That's the other group, and I think that is incumbent on people like me to work on. I think the industry needs to have a think about how correct scientific information will be communicated with the general public.
Okay, I'm going to wrap it up. We'll say that I think we'll say that we've, ladies and gentlemen, I think we've absolutely heard a remarkable talk. We'll say from Alice. We'll say that setting out information that I think would be pretty new to many of us, and the challenge has been issued as to how we'll say, as individuals, as an industry, how we can actually get. Help people to be better informed. It's a huge, huge challenge. Professor, we are exceptionally grateful to you. And I can just say like that, your talk, we hope to have that up on the internet pretty soon, we'll say that, because I think the wider that talk becomes available to people, we'll say that it has been a splendid talk. Please, ladies and gentlemen, would you give Alice a big hand? It's I'm handing over to Kevin Toomey now. We're not having we're carrying straight through, but anybody needs a comfort break, go take it now, we'll say, and come quietly in. Thank you.